Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into another beer from River North Brewery out of Denver, Colorado. We've reviewed quite a few of their beers as of late, and indeed we've done plenty in the past. And I get all of these from Tavour. There's a reason that this is one of those brewers I keep coming back to, because every time I get something from them, I'm really glad that I did. So today we're jumping into a beer called Buckets of Bolts, and this is a barley wine that clocks in at 12.2% ABV. This is just a standard barley wine, no barrel aging. So we are going to jump back into the depths and see exactly what makes this beer style so great, why it's so layered and nuanced and so big, and why this is my personal favorite beer style of them all. No tricks, no gimmicks, just a barley wine laying bare in no hidden cover-ups, no additives, no barrel aging, just the base beer itself. So I'm really excited. This is one I've had for a few months, and I set aside when I was in the mood to get back into just a base barley wine. It's been a while since we've reviewed one, so we're jumping in. Today is that day. So we're going to get this bottle cracked gently. All right, that came right off. All right, and we're going to get this poured. So this is that glass I got from my Prairie Artisan Stout Sampler Pack. Since this is a relatively small bottle, it's 12.7 ounces or something like that. I won't quite get the whole thing in, but I thought this would be a nice glass since stout glasses do work well for barley wine. So let's get that poured right in. I'm going to go down the middle with a bit more aggression to give it a chance to form its head. And we will stop right there. Yep, not quite the whole bottle in there. Plenty left to spare. Visually, I could see as I was pouring this, and yes, indeed, it is that classic caramel color that is the norm for a barley wine. Again, these run the full color spectrum from the lightest of the light to the darkest of the dark and everything in between. But this classic kind of caramel color, ambery caramel color, that is kind of the prototypical color you're going to see on a barley wine. It looks absolutely fantastic. Barley wines are kind of one of those styles you never really know what you're going to get until you get it cracked. They do tend to be pretty active in carbonation, but they aren't all. This one seems relatively active. I see some kind of small, medium small bubbles still rising up from the bottom, but it did form a pretty nice creamy thick head here to start. So far so good. Let's get right up over this for a sniff. All right, so this one does have some pretty common barley wine aromas you would associate typically with the style, but it's maybe not pushing quite as heavily into the underlying kind of fruity side and kind of cobbler side, though there is a little bit of an element of that. This one actually, I'm getting a lot more underpinnings from the actual malts talking to me themselves. So I'm getting caramel, and I'm definitely getting a grainy sense, and there's indeed even a slight kind of sweetness on the nose to it. Where I'm getting kind of the fruit accents, it smells almost like predominantly raisins with maybe even a slight grape-like quality. I'm not getting tons of figs or plums, which you would normally pick up on the nose, even often some apricots or peach. It's really just kind of strictly kind of a two-way balance between the malt characteristics and just kind of the raisiny grape-like quality. So a little bit of a deviation from the norm. These are all aromas you can get, but typically they have a lot bigger nose with a lot more happening. They're kind of a busy beer style, but it smells really nice. Head is settled down a bit. I got a nice cling, nice little pad floating on top. Let's jump right in and see what the standard barley wine is all about. Oh yeah. This is nice. So even though we couldn't pick up all of the associated massive spectrum of aromas in the aroma profile, when we get into the flavor, this is classic barley wine. It's absolutely massive. And indeed, the aroma smelled nice, but it wasn't quite as pungent either as you would normally associate with the barley wine. But as soon as you get into this beer and you swallow, it just opens up and it's huge. So there is a lot that's happening in this one. This is not like every other barley wine, and we will talk specifics, but it's got a lot of interesting twists and turns that I really like. So the first thing of note is that the predominant kind of underlying, you would associate this with the barley wine aroma kind of characteristics that often translate into the glass. What did actually pop through? Well, in the flavor profile, there's a little bit of a raisin flavor. That's pretty common in a barley wine, but I'm not tasting any grape. And indeed, a ton of layering of fruit you would normally often be able to pick up in a barley wine aroma that I did not in this one are present in the flavor profile. So there is a very, very big volume of fig and plum. There's also underlying apricot. There's nothing really peach-like, but it's distinctly apricot mixing with raisin and fig and plum. It's very nice. So it's got this deep kind of rich fruit medley, and as is so often the case, and indeed I would argue the norm for most barley wines, we're not talking raw fruit here. We're talking fruit that's been taken and put into a baked good, be it a pie, a cobbler, a pudding, whatever the case may be. That's what it is. So it draws out this richness and this added depth from the fruit that you wouldn't get from the raw state. And it's very, very nice. The other thing that happens in this beer that you don't always get is that there is actually a fair kick of bittering. And what that does is take these underlying other malt bill characteristic traits, like I got on the nose a little bit of caramel. In the flavor profile, I'm getting caramel, but it's richer. There's nothing I would say tastes like coffee. It's almost like dark. It's not caramelized sugar, because it doesn't quite have that depth, but it's got this distinct caramelly sense, and it seems to kind of richen when it mixes with the natural underlying bitters in this one. Now, typically barley wines are not a particularly bitter beer style. They can be. Some really, really are. I've had some that would put IPAs to shame. This one, though, if we're comparing to the norm, does have a bit more presence, and it gives a little more oomph to it, especially the underlying richness of this malt bill. So these caramelizations, these underlying ambery, whatever combination of malts that they use in here is really kind of coming to the forefront, driving from that bitter side of this beer. And I'm not saying it's, again, like I like to use the West Coast IPA kind of comparison. It's nothing like that. But compared to a standard barley wine, yeah, it's got a bit more prevalent bittering effect in your face than you would normally find. If I were to guess, my perception, 25-ish IBUs. So it's not super bitter, but there's enough there that, hey, yeah, I can actually taste what the hops bring to the table. It's a very, very nice beer. As with barley wines, no matter what they bring to the table, it's a very complex style. The aroma's complex, the flavor's complex, and they tend to be big in your face, and this is no exception. It's been a while since I've done just a standard barley wine, and I'm really glad that I chose today to crack into this one. This is just what I needed. I absolutely love it. Big complex beer. We're going to jump back in. We're going to talk body. We're going to talk mouthfeel. We're going to talk balance. And we're going to talk finish. Take two. Okay. This is a kind of a low end of medium heavy. It's maybe not quite as oppressively heavy as you would expect for a typical barley wine. 12.2%. You know, it's kind of on the low end of average for barley wine ABV, but it's certainly in the norm spectrum. Regardless of the style, the body isn't quite as heavy as I would expect for above a 12% ABV on a beer. It's on the bottom end of medium heavy. It's not off by a ton, but I did expect just a little more oomph, a little more presence, a little more weight when I swallow. In terms of the mouthfeel, this one actually has a fair bit of resistance to it, and it's one that actually is quite creamy when you agitate around the palate. So texturally, it's very, very nice. Kind of that added thickness that you get as you're agitating on the palate does kind of kick up the kind of commingling of the body and the mouthfeel to kind of overact that not quite as heavy. So it does balance out very, very well. Very nice mouthfeel. The other thing that's interesting on this, and you don't often get this in barley wines, you can, but there actually is a little bit of dryness in this beer. It takes about 30 seconds after each sip before that pops in, but there is a little bit of dryness. And it's subtle. It's right on the tip, but it's not completely full and wet and round all the way to the end. Indeed, you notice the dryness long before the flavors dissipate to the end of the finish. And that kind of brings me into the balance side and the finish side of the equation. So balance-wise, in a barley wine that's just a standard barley wine, no barrel, no additives, the balance, we're really talking about the malts that they chose, the ratios they're in, and the yeasts that they chose. I have no clue what malts that they used. I have no clue what yeast strain that they used. But I gotta say, from a beer drinker's perspective, the balance on this is fantastic. Whatever malt ratios, whatever yeast volume, it's exquisitely chosen. There's a lot of nuance in a barley wine, and if you make the wrong decision in any part of it, certain aspects of the beer can pop up bigger and kind of make other elements fight for attention. And in a beer like a barley wine, where everything is just layer upon layer upon layer upon layer upon layer because they're so big and intense and nuanced, all of those layers of nuance are kind of vying for attention. And that's part of the fun of a barley wine compared to a lot of other different beer styles is, yes, they're big beers, yes, they're high ABV, but it's just these subtleties, these nuances that you can pick out that just kind of interweave and constantly move in and out as you're experiencing each sip of the beer. They nailed it on this. So the balance, whatever they chose of their ingredients, absolutely money on this beer. Then that brings us finally to the finish. So finishes on barley wines are kind of all over the board. It's not a beer style that has the longest finish in the world compared to, say, a big West Coast IPA or a big barrel-aged imperial stout or something like that. We're strictly talking the standard barley wine. But this one is one of those barley wines that actually does have a little bit bigger of a bitter kick, and that actually really does help drive out the length of the finish. This isn't quite top tier, but it doesn't miss the mark by much. And, it's not super long lingering bitters, but what that does, especially in tandem with the drying, is it brings this crispness, this slight truncation to the end, and it really starts to poke out the bigger, more impactful flavors that linger on the palate, as well as the underlying bitters. And the bitters really kind of disappear about the minute and a quarter mark, but what they do is drive out the underlying lingering big, bold flavors. And on this one in particular, it's the underlying caramelization from the malt in tandem with right where we started, the raisin. And it's very, very nice. This is a big, big beer. I absolutely love barley wine. This is one of the harder beer styles to get your hands on. It's not impossible, but that's one of the biggest treats from Tavour to me to this day is how many barley wines they have in their rotation, and I grab them all when I see them because I love them. This is a big, expensive style that is small batch or just one-offs by most brewers. It's not something you're going to go into a brewer on average and find on a tap in their tap room. This is a one-off. It's a more expensive beer style. It's not a beer style for everybody, but for those of us that are barley wine heads, it's a wonderful thing. And this is another great example of exactly why I love this style so much. I'm going to take my time, sip on this one, count my scores. When we come back, we will get this beer ranked from top to bottom. All right, now that we've gotten to enjoy this beer, we're going to get it ranked. This was River North Brewery's Buckets of Bolts, a barley wine clocking in at 12.2% ABV. River North Brewery is based in Denver, Colorado. So this to me was one of those beers that is just a really great example of why I love barley wine so much and why I think that if you've never tried it, it's definitely worth your time. It's one of the biggest beer styles there is, and it is packed full of layers of aroma and flavor. It's texturally interesting. It's just got a very unique kind of side to it for a beer. It's a big beer. They're big and bold and in your face, and they're very layered and nuanced. It's an extremely complex beer style, and that's what I love about a barley wine. There's a lot of common traits you'll find in them, but they're all a little bit different. And yeah, I love a good barrel-aged barley wine as much as this next guy. I review a fair bit of them. But just coming back to a standard barley wine, again, it's just always a treat and just a really nice way to jump back in and say, yeah, I remember why I fell in love with this beer style in the first place. And it's barley wines like this that really do it for me. So let's go through the scores here. Getting through kind of the grand scope, this was another one of those beers that did extremely well in the vast majority of categories. Indeed, there were only two where it did not get a perfect score, so we're going to jump straight to those. The first one was the body. The body was nice. It was robust. It was certainly above average, but not quite as weighty as I expected for barley wine at 12.2%. It didn't really detract from the beer. And like I said, it was above average, but maybe just not quite as weighty. 12% is a pretty high ABV, as most barley wines have. But this one just missed the mark for me just a little bit. The body, I give an 8 out of 10. The second category that did not get a perfect score, and this one really only missed it by a thin margin as well, was the head and the retention. In general, this one did pour quite a nice head, but barley wines are like quite a few other styles. You never really know what you're going to get, and they can often be quite effervescent and rush up constantly, which can make that head collapse a little quicker than you would see in other beer styles. There was a little bit of that here, but this one actually did have a pretty good staying power. Indeed, I was watching it the whole time and thinking, oh, this is kind of still holding out hope. I didn't think it would last as long as it did, but really it was excellent. Well above average for a barley wine to be certain, and it nearly held out the whole time, so just missed it by a hair. Head and retention did get a 9 out of 10, which means the final 8 categories did get a perfect 10 out of 10. Those categories are aroma, taste, mouthfeel, finish, appearance, balance, feeling, and intangible, my subjective thoughts category, and example of style. So that does bring the total score on River North Brewery's Buckets of Bolts to a 97 out of 100. Yeah, just another top tier beer here, guys. Not only as of late, but also from River North. I mean, I've had a lot of their beers recently, and a lot in the past as well. There's a reason I keep grabbing them. If you haven't tried their beers yet, definitely worth your while. I get mine from Tavour. I'm sure you can grab them in other different markets, but yeah, absolutely worth it. This is a fantastic barley wine. If you, like me, are a barley wine lover, this is definitely one to keep on your radar. I know you probably do the same thing I do because it's a harder beer style to find. You see one, you grab it. It's just the way most barley wine lovers are. So if you do see this one, yeah, I can recommend it wholeheartedly. It's awesome. No tricks, no gimmicks, no barrel aging, just a classic barley wine. Great example of this style. I would recommend to any fan of big beers or barley wine lovers indeed. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live, just turn on your notifications, hit the bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.